These are the slopes of Mount Gilboa, the specific geographical site where a long and bitter rivalry finally came to a bloody end. For years, this landscape was the backdrop to an exhausting, one-sided manhunt. King Saul relentlessly pursued David across the wilderness, giving David every human justification to harbor a deep, vengeful hatred. But then, devastating news arrives from the battlefield. Both Saul and his son, Jonathan, have been killed. Overnight, the ultimate obstacle to the throne vanishes. David's greatest threat is completely erased, and his forced exile is over. The news is delivered by an Amalekite messenger, who claims he personally struck the killing blow to Saul. To prove his story, he presents David with the fallen king's royal crown. The expectation for a moment like this is clear. The messenger assumes he will be handsomely rewarded for handing the kingdom directly to a rival. A massive power vacuum has instantly opened up, and the path of least resistance is laid out right in front of David. In this chaotic moment, the pressing question is whether David will seize power through standard political opportunism, or if he is governed by a completely different law. David's immediate reaction shatters every political expectation. He rejects the prize entirely, ordering the messenger's execution. His response is driven by a strict, uncompromising principle: absolute reverence for God's anointed leader. David doesn't see the Amalekites' claim as a convenient favor. By taking credit for killing the king, the messenger has confessed to a blasphemous, capital crime against the divine order. For David, strict adherence to God's sovereignty carries far more weight than celebrating his own political triumph. Then, justice gives way to profound sorrow. David pens a devastating lament, the Song of the Bow, expressing overwhelming grief for his closest companion, Jonathan. Shockingly, David also offers genuine praise for Saul, separating his personal suffering from Saul's rightful position. This reveals an incredible breadth of character. In this moment, grief totally eclipses any desire for vengeance, proving David's ability to transcend his private grievances. With Saul's death, the years of flight and pursuit are over. This chapter records the conclusion of a long, painful era in Israel's history. Just as these physical foundations anchor an ancient city, David's rejection of the Amalekites' opportunism ensures his own rise begins on a base of integrity. He demonstrates a commitment to prioritizing God's will and honoring those who came before him, establishing a standard for how he will eventually use his authority. By choosing restraint at the exact moment a crown was placed in his hands, David shows he is ready for the responsibilities that lie ahead. When we look at how modern leaders and society typically react to the downfall of a bitter rival, the contrast is stark. It is incredibly rare to find someone who can step into absolute power and utterly abandon their personal grudges in the process. David manages to hold two immense concepts together: the capacity for fierce public justice and heavy, empathetic private grief. His reaction on that day stands as a challenging, eternal standard for anyone entrusted with authority. It defines exactly what it means to be a leader after God's own heart. David is finally anointed king over Judah, but the moment the crown touches his head, he steps into a landscape where the throne is inseparable from immediate, high-stakes conflict. Hostile neighboring nations are pressing in on his borders. Inside the country, Saul's former commanders are violently refusing to cede control, waging a fierce rebellion against the new administration. David inherits a role defined by a legacy of failure. He is following Saul, a predecessor whose reign proved how quickly a divine appointment can dissolve into a total rupture of favor. Saul's decline wasn't a sudden accident. It was a slow erosion of spiritual alignment under pressure. Now, David faces those same pressures with the same terrifying precedent hanging over him. How does a leader survive this kind of geopolitical squeeze without suffering the same collapse of character as the king before him? Surviving this environment requires a shift in how we view spiritual intimacy. It has to move from an abstract feeling into a concrete operational strategy. With enemies closing in, the obvious military move is to strike fast. David does the opposite. He brings his momentum to a dead stop to initiate a quiet, vertical dialogue with God. This is the input phase. David actively asks for precise directional guidance. He refuses to draw up his own battle plans and then asks God to sign off on them after the fact. Then comes the process. When David receives the guidance, he executes it immediately. He proceeds with a complete lack of hesitation or secondary questioning. We often treat spiritual intimacy like an unpredictable weather pattern, a warm, ethereal feeling that fluctuates based on our mood or our circumstances. The text suggests a different definition, a mechanical cycle. It is a rhythm of single-minded seeking followed directly by unquestioning execution. By conditioning evanouissement on a specific command, David effectively crowds out his own instincts. The internal ambition that led Saul to compromise has no space to take root when the king's only job is to respond. Continuous obedience serves as the only reliable mechanism to keep a spiritual bond intact when external threats are actively trying to tear you apart. This quiet discipline is immediately put to the test in the harsh reality of a physical battlefield against Abner's rebelling forces. Does an internal spiritual discipline actually translate into a physical advantage in the real world? The casualty statistics recorded in 2 Samuel provide a definitive answer. The disparity between the two sides is staggering. Abner's rebellious camp loses 360 men. David's obedient camp loses exactly 20. This 18-to-1 ratio goes beyond military skill. It shows the physical weight of divine support given to a leader who refuses to act on his own. Compare this sustained strength against the exhausting pendulum relationship many of us experience, where connection feels random, sporadic, and entirely dependent on how we feel that morning. The text links the survival of the kingdom directly to these two habits, identifying God's direction and then following it without reservation. Unwavering obedience delivers internal peace, but it also delivers the strength and provision needed for the physical battles you face every day.
When imagining the establishment of a divine kingdom, we usually picture a process defined by holiness, but the historical record of David's rise looks more like a sequence of backroom deals and brutal workplace politics. At this point in 2 Samuel, the nation is split by civil war. While David has established a stronghold in Hebron, the surrounding tribes remain divided and hostile, held together by old loyalties and new fears. The biblical text refuses to sanitize its heroes. It builds the story of the kingdom on a foundation of defection, sexual scandal, and state-sanctioned murder. Behind the throne, generals and court officials are operating for themselves. They treat the survival of the nation as a secondary concern to their own careers. This creates a tension. When every player on the field is driven by self-interest, we have to ask if God is still directing the outcome, or if the story has descended into pure chaos.
Look at this from the ground level, starting with Abner, the commander of the opposing northern army. When he decides to defect to David, it isn't because he's had a change of heart. He switches sides because a puppet king dared to question his conduct with a royal concubine. His pride is bruised, so he turns the fate of the northern tribes into a bargaining chip, trading the loyalty of an entire people for his own political safety. Then there is Joab, David's general. Joab sees Abner's defection as a threat to his own rank and an opportunity to settle a blood feud for a brother Abner killed in battle. Joab meets Abner at the city gates under the pretense of a private talk. He slips a dagger from his cloak and murders the rival commander, acting without David's knowledge or permission. David is left managing a precarious unification. His new coalition is now tainted by a murder committed by his own right-hand man. This leads to a moment of startling honesty. David admits that although he is the anointed king, he is powerless to rein in the violent men leading his military. From this perspective, human depravity has won. The schemes of selfish men have successfully dictated the direction of the kingdom. But if we pull back from the ground-level view, a different pattern emerges. What looks like a breakdown of order is actually the silent movement of a plan that uses those very betrayals as its machinery. Abner's selfish defection was the specific trigger causing the hostile northern tribes to break away and snap into place around David. And Joab's murder of Abner meant the one leader capable of fracturing this union was removed,
locking David's control into place. David's lack of military power over Joab forced him to use a different tool. He chose to publicly mourn Abner, tearing his clothes and weeping before the people. That act of sincere grief did more than any execution could. It cleared David of suspicion and won the political loyalty of the northern tribes. Every betrayal and murder became a gear in a larger machine. Human depravity was the fuel God used to advance his decree. Viewed from above, the web of human scheming aligns perfectly. It built a kingdom that relied on grace rather than the competence of its leaders. David's admission that he was an anointed king, but too weak to stop the darkness in his own circle, reveals a fundamental problem. We want leaders who are good, but we find that human goodness rarely has the power to subdue human evil. If even a king like David couldn't control the violence of his generals, it suggests that a human throne isn't a sufficient solution for a broken world. This gap in David's reign points toward a king whose authority isn't limited by the people around him. It requires a ruler who doesn't just mourn evil, but possesses the inherent power to heal it. David's weakness wasn't a failure of the story. It was a demonstration that we need a divine king, Jesus Christ, to do what no human ruler, however righteous, can manage. You can see these same dynamics in your own life: the workplace backstabbing, the unfairness, or the malicious rumors that feel out of your control. The instinct is to act like Joab. We want to take matters into our own hands and use our own strength to force the outcome we think is fair. But David shows us a different path. By choosing restraint and leaving judgment to God, you can navigate a hostile environment without losing your integrity. The malicious plans of others are small compared to the sovereignty of a God who can use those very plans to fulfill his purpose. You can let go of the need for personal revenge. When you realize that God is orchestrating the chaos toward a righteous end, you are finally free to rest. "3,000 years ago, in the blistering heat of the ancient Near East, two military captains walked into a royal court carrying a macabre prize hidden inside a worn leather pouch. They had just committed high treason. Bana and Rechab crept into their own master's bedroom, murdered him in his sleep, and severed his head to present as a gruesome gift to the ascending monarch, King David. To these commanders, power followed a strict transactional logic: eliminate an obstacle for the new king and secure a position in his empire. In the Bronze Age landscape, this ruthlessness was standard. Upward mobility meant stepping on whoever stood between you and the throne. Executing this playbook to perfection, the two captains marched into David's stronghold at Hebron, brimming with absolute confidence. They were handing the king a guaranteed victory on a silver platter. But their airtight strategy contained a lethal flaw. They projected the values of typical warlords onto a man operating under a completely different moral framework. They assumed the new king wanted power at any cost. Instead, the exact act they engineered to secure his highest favor was about to trigger his absolute wrath. Operating on ambitious assumptions without learning the specific standards of an authority creates a vacuum of knowledge. In a royal court, that vacuum is deadly. When David looked inside that leather pouch, he felt zero gratitude. His leadership was anchored in divine righteousness, not political opportunism. Furthermore, David operated his court on strict legal protocols. He immediately cited his own history. Years earlier, another opportunist brought David news of the previous king's death, expecting a massive payout. David ordered that man executed on the spot at Ziklag. Bana and Rechab walked completely blind into a court that had a highly publicized, deeply documented history of executing people for this exact behavior. Ignorance of an established law offers zero protection when standing before a righteous judge. The historical account captures a horrifying realization. In real time, the captain's entire worldview collapses as they watch the king's face harden into a death sentence. David gave the immediate order to his guards. The men who thought they were earning royal crowns were dragged out and killed. Assuming a holy authority operates by the corrupt mechanics of the world guarantees utter destruction. 3 millennia later, modern spiritual seekers walk into the exact same trap. This diagram models our modern error. We try to buy favor with the Creator using a secular, transactional framework. We stack up societal success, climb corporate ladders, or perform secular definitions of good deeds, assuming heaven grades on a cultural curve. Attempting to plug our shifting cultural values into the eternal priorities of God creates severe incompatibility. How do we avoid the fatal error of those ancient commanders? We have to accept that God cannot be lobbied or impressed by earthly social capital. The Creator dictates the parameters, and humanity must adapt to them. The righteous standards of God are not a mystery we have to blindly guess at. They are clearly documented precedents. The Bible serves as that comprehensive record. It contains the explicit, uncompromising will of the King, detailing exactly what he demands. If we actually want to please him, we have to relentlessly study that text. We must immerse ourselves in his actual words before we take action in his name. True obedience requires doing the hard work to learn the heart of the King, rather than guessing with the mind of the world.
Seven years of civil war came to a close following the death of the northern leader, Ishbosheth. The elders of the northern tribes traveled to Hebron to acknowledge David as the king chosen by God, finally uniting all Israel under a single crown. This unified nation entered a fragile peace. Maintaining it required a central capital that could sit above the rivalries of this divided landscape. Jerusalem offered the perfect solution. It sat directly on the border between Benjamin and Judah, functioning as a neutral zone. By securing a city independent of any single tribe's influence, David could establish a truly national central government. The city was built atop a ridge, protected by natural barriers and steep valleys on nearly every side. At the time, it was held by the Jebusites, a Canaanite group who believed their position was invincible. The Jebusites mocked David's approach, shouting that even the blind and the lame could defend such a fortress against his army. For David's reign to succeed, he had to overcome a fortress where conventional military strength seemed destined to fail. David looked for a flaw in the Jebusite defense and found it in their water supply, a hidden groove that drew water from the Gihon spring into the city. His elite forces navigated the narrow darkness of this subterranean shaft, bypassing the walls to take the city from within. After the capture, David fortified the city's perimeter, renaming the stronghold the City of David and centering his administration there. This conquest established Jerusalem as the spiritual and political heart of the Jewish people, driving the Zionist movement toward modern fulfillment in 1948. The city's ancient corridors returned to Jewish hands again in 1967, following centuries of shifting control. The status of the city remains a focal point of global diplomacy, involving the interests of modern Arab states and the administration of Donald Trump. To build his palace, David looked north to Tyre, importing skilled stonemasons and the famously durable wood of the Lebanon cedar. David solidified his power by combining these strategic alliances with the establishment of a permanent national capital. The unification of Israel presented a threat to the Philistines, who launched a preemptive strike to reassert their dominance. David responded by establishing a habit of consultation, pausing before the counterattack to ask God for specific strategic guidance. Following the divine instruction, David defeated the Philistines so thoroughly that they abandoned their religious idols on the field to be burned by the Israelites. When the Philistines regrouped for a second assault, David consulted the same source again. The instructions had changed. Success in this new engagement required a different approach, showing that David's strategy relied on constant, active communication. God told him to wait for the distinct sound of marching in the tops of the balsam trees. David struck only when he heard that signal, indicating that a heavenly army was moving ahead of his own troops. David's battlefield supremacy was the direct result of his willingness to ask for direction before every move. Despite this rigorous discipline in war, David possessed a significant vulnerability in his personal conduct. While he sought guidance for every battle, the record shows he took wives and concubines without ever asking for divine approval. He relied on external intelligence to defeat foreign kings, yet relied entirely on his own impulses when it came to his personal desires.
This created a glaring contradiction in his leadership, leaving his private life completely unguided. This pattern of selective obedience remains a common human struggle. We are quick to seek help when facing external crises that are beyond our control. We often wall off our private desires, moving forward without consultation because we fear a negative answer to our impulses. The result is often self-inflicted damage and broken relationships that we only seek to repair once the consequences become overwhelming. Enduring victory requires the same level of inquiry in our personal choices that we apply to the external battles we fear. "3,000 years ago, moving the ultimate symbol of God's presence across this challenging terrain required more than just an army. King David had just secured his throne and conquered Jerusalem. To mark the moment, he gathered 30,000 of his elite troops to escort the Ark of the Covenant into his new capital. This ancient scroll contains the specific Levitical laws governing the Ark. It dictates that the sacred object must be carried on the shoulders of consecrated priests. But David chose a different path. He loaded the Ark onto a brand new ox cart, a transportation method he had seen used by the Philistines. He organized a massive parade filled with harps, lyres, and tambourines. But beneath the music, human ingenuity had quietly replaced divine instruction. When passion is separated from obedience, it quickly turns into presumption. The rough Canaanite roads exposed the flaw in David's plan. As the oxen stumbled, the heavy wooden wheels jolted, causing the ark to violently shift. A man named Uzzah acted on pure instinct, reaching out a bare hand to stabilize the holy chest. The response was absolute. Uzzah was struck dead on the spot. The music died away, and a celebration of 30,000 people froze in sudden horror. David's triumphant joy vanished, replaced by an immediate, paralyzing fear of the God he was trying to honor. He realized the ark wasn't a manageable piece of state property. The gap between human frailty and divine holiness cannot be bridged by good intentions alone. 3 months pass. While the ark remains in the house of a man named Obed-Edom, David hears report after report of the household being blessed. He begins to see that the holiness that once terrified him wasn't meant for destruction, but for life, provided it was approached on God's terms. He abandons his previous royal strategies. If he wants the ark in Jerusalem, he must submit to the ancient requirements he had previously set aside. There are no ox carts this time. Instead, Levite priests slide wooden poles through the rings of the ark and hoist the weight of the gold-covered chest directly onto their own shoulders. Taking that weight onto human bone and muscle represents a shift. David stopped treating God as a convenience and accepted the heavy burden of true obedience. The second journey begins with a new, deliberate rhythm. After the priests take exactly 6 steps forward, the entire procession comes to a dead stop. At every 6-step interval, they sacrifice an ox and a fattened calf. It is a ritual repeated for every few yards of the multi-kilometer route. The first journey was an unbroken sprint ending in tragedy. The second creeps incrementally in an agonizingly slow stop-and-go pace. As sacrifices accumulate at each stop, the staggering cost reveals David paying a price far beyond the law to atone for his carelessness. Genuine reverence is inherently anti-convenience. Its deliberate slowness and heavy cost are exactly what separate it from cheap enthusiasm. As the slow, blood-stained procession finally nears the ancient stone foundations of the city, the king prepares to enter his own stronghold. But instead of asserting his authority, David steps down from his position and begins to physically shed his heavy, intricate royal garments. He replaces his crown and robes with a simple linen ephod, the basic, unadorned uniform of a lowly servant. Stripped of his royal identity, David dances with all his might over the rough stones, completely ignoring how a monarch is expected to behave in public. Encountering the king of the universe leaves no room for human ego. Even an earthly ruler must dismantle his own status and surrender his sovereignty. But watching from a high window is David's wife Michal. From her vantage point, she watches the king with growing contempt. She is looking for a monarch who carries himself with the weight and distance expected of a throne, not a man leaping in the street like a commoner. When she confronts him later, David gives her an enduring answer. He tells her he will gladly become even more undignified and even lower in his own eyes for the sake of the Lord. The historical record concludes that Michal remained barren for the rest of her life, a symbol of the ultimate dead end of a faith built on human pride rather than submission. The same holiness that once felt like a threat of death becomes a source of endless blessing, but only for those willing to leave their royal robes behind and bow in the dirt.
King David has achieved a season of peace. With borders secure, he resides in a luxurious cedar wood palace, enjoying the stability he fought to secure. But looking out from his royal estate, David experiences a jarring sense of dissonance. He lives in permanent wealth, while the Ark of the Covenant, representing God's presence, sits outside in a temporary, humble tent. He decides to correct this imbalance. He resolves to honor God by constructing a magnificent, permanent temple, offering the best of his kingdom's resources. He runs the idea by the prophet Nathan, who immediately endorses this noble ambition without hesitation. But that very night, the plan hits a wall. God intercepts the prophet and issues a definitive no to the construction project. This rejection raises a specific question. What would lead God to refuse a gesture of such obvious honor and devotion? God provides his immediate reasoning to David. The divine presence has never required or requested a static structure of wood and stone to dwell in. To understand God's response, look at this diagram of the Hebrew word bait, or house, splitting into two paths. David wanted the first, a physical dwelling for God. But God announces a reversal. He will establish an eternal house, a royal dynasty, for David. God's veto is not a rejection of David's heart. He takes David's plan for earthly real estate and elevates it to a permanent divine legacy. This new arrangement is known as the Davidic covenant. It operates strictly as an unconditional promise of grace, distinct from any transactional human contract where a failure to perform breaks the deal. It is deeply intimate. God commits to a specific father-son relationship with David's royal lineage moving forward, and the terms are entirely secure. Even when future descendants fail or face discipline, God guarantees his loving kindness will never be revoked from the bloodline. Hearing this, David's reaction is immediate. He strips away his royal ego in the face of this overwhelming promise. Sitting in the tent, he offers a prayer anchored in his own profound insignificance when compared to the vastness of God's grace. He exhibits total submission. He abandons his lifelong dream of building the temple without a single hint of resentment. David demonstrates that devotion is measured by a willingness to lay down our most meaningful ambitions when they collide with a different plan. In terms of the immediate historical logistics, God rejects David because his history as a warrior precluded him from the task. God specifically designated his son, Solomon, as the architect of the physical temple. Solomon will construct that physical building, but physical buildings are inherently vulnerable. That temple will eventually be destroyed. The dynasty God just promised, however, is indestructible. Looking at this timeline, we trace the covenant's theological trajectory. A promised everlasting throne must logically extend beyond normal human mortality, surging forward past human limits. It culminates in a specific arrival, Jesus Christ, stepping into history as the eternal Son of David. Because Jesus possesses an eternal life and an unending reign, he provides the bridge between a mortal lineage and a throne that literally never ends. 2 Samuel 7 proves that God's grace is never limited to the temporary structures humanity tries to build for him. It is anchored in the eternal reality he actively builds for humanity. To understand David's reign, look at this map. Ancient Israel was under constant siege, hemmed in by the Philistines, Moabites, Arameans, and Edomites. God promised him rest from all enemies, yet the geopolitical reality was hostile borders aggressively pressing inward. This creates a tension between a divine word of peace and the violent, dust-choked reality of the Bronze Age. David's subsequent military campaign functions as the active execution of that divine promise. These battles represent the unfolding of a rescue plan designed to establish the security God had already decreed. Divine sovereignty often moves through human action. For David, establishing a holy kingdom required the active removal of the threats that had destabilized Israel for generations. The campaign moves fast. David subdues the Philistines and breaks the power of the Syrian kings. The record repeats a single defining fact: the Lord gave David victory wherever he went. When the focus shifts to Moab, the war becomes more personal and more severe. Jewish tradition suggests the Moabites had betrayed David by killing his parents, an act that explains the uncompromising nature of his judgment. David forces the captured Moabite soldiers to lie flat on the earth. He uses a coarse rope to measure them. He applies a strict mathematical judgment. 2/3 of the men on that line are marked for execution. Only the final 1/3 of the line is spared, preserved to become servants of the kingdom. This physical division is a typology mirroring a spiritual process. Prophets described Moab as people settled in complacency, like rotting wine. By cutting away 2/3, David enacts Zechariah's refining process, removing the majority so a purified remnant survives the fire. Following these victories, a massive influx of gold, silver, and bronze from the Arameans and Edomites flows into Jerusalem. In the ancient world, this wealth usually fueled a king's personal luxury or his political ambitions. David makes a radical departure from that precedent. He redirects the entire spoils of war to the Lord. He consecrates these pagan riches, stockpiling them to fund the future blueprint of the temple. David treats every victory as a resource for worship. He ensures that the wealth of nations ends up glorifying the God who provided the strength to win it. Military conquest only matters if justice is at the center. Once borders are secure, focus shifts to the inner workings of the throne itself. David builds a cabinet of recorders, priests, and secretaries. He uses this administrative structure to protect the vulnerable and ensure that God's equity and righteousness are felt by every citizen in the land. This subduing of the Philistines, Israel's most persistent enemy, prompts a look at our own lives. We often face patterns of sin or weakness that seem as permanent as those ancient borders. These require the same decisive conquest rather than a strategy of perpetual avoidance. It forces a question regarding how we use our own influence. In our workplaces and families, we are challenged to use our authority to serve others with fairness, echoing the administrative justice David established in Jerusalem. Beyond the personal application, David's reign provides a map for the future. His Bronze Age kingdom is the primary blueprint for a much greater reality. David's defeat of physical neighbors points to Jesus Christ's dismantling of sin and death. While David secured a kingdom's territory, Christ secures an eternal inheritance by placing every spiritual enemy under his feet. We live as citizens of that coming kingdom. We are called to tarry the heart of David, possessing both the warrior's resolve to fight sin and the worshipper's desire to lay every victory at the feet of the king. King David had consolidated his empire. By the time he was firmly established on the throne of Israel, his military campaigns had subdued the surrounding factions, leaving him with absolute, unchecked authority. Look at this diagram showing a typical ancient Near Eastern dynasty transition. When a new ruler took power, the standard operating procedure was brutally efficient. Rival heirs were methodically crossed out and eliminated to secure the new king's hold on the throne. If you belonged to the fallen regime and somehow survived that initial purge, your entire existence became an exercise in paranoia. You vanished into the margins of society, keeping your head down to avoid detection. Carrying the bloodline of a former king made you a permanent walking target. In this era, sparing a rival was a political liability that most rulers simply refused to accept. Deep in the barren region of Lodebar lived a man named Mephibosheth. He was the grandson of the fallen King Saul and the son of David's closest friend, Jonathan. When news of his family's military defeat reached his nurse years earlier, she grabbed him to flee but dropped him in her panic. The fall left him permanently crippled in both feet, completely unable to walk without assistance or fend for himself. Then the exact scenario he feared most arrived.
word reached Lo-Debar that King David was actively searching for anyone left in the house of Saul. Mephibosheth's hidden exile was over. The royal guards summoned him to Jerusalem. Based on every historical precedent of the Bronze Age, receiving a direct invitation from the rival king who conquered your family meant an immediate execution. His journey to the palace forced a physically compromised, perfectly helpless outcast into a direct collision with the most powerful man in the known world. Mephibosheth enters the royal court in pure terror.
He immediately collapses face down onto the expansive floor of the throne room, bracing for the killing blow. Before the king can even state his business, Mephibosheth refers to himself as a dead dog. In the ancient world, this was a stark cultural declaration of total worthlessness. He is offering absolute submission. David looks at him and says 3 words: "Do not fear." That phrase instantly shatters the survival logic Mephibosheth had lived by his entire life. With a single sentence, the normal geopolitical rules of vengeance are suspended. The story of a bloody conquest halts, pivoting entirely to a narrative of mercy. The driving force behind this unnatural mercy is an ancient Hebrew concept called hesed. It translates roughly to a steadfast, covenantal love. This diagram illustrates hesed. David and Jonathan made a sacred vow protecting each other's families. Their lineages are bound by that promise. The material impact is immediate. David returns vast ancestral lands, everything belonging to Saul, back to this crippled heir. But land requires labor to generate value. So David assigns a servant named Ziba, along with his entire household, to farm the property, ensuring a steady stream of wealth and sustenance. This covenant of hesed actively reverses Mephibosheth's generational curse. David guarantees his financial future, turning a certain death sentence into permanent prosperity. Yet the return of the land is secondary to David's final provision. He tells Mephibosheth that he will eat at the royal banquet table continuously. Dining at the king's table was the ultimate mark of elite protection. It meant you were permanently, intimately connected to the sovereign. There is also a profound physical reality to this royal invitation. When Mephibosheth is settling on his seat, the heavy wood covers his crippled feet. His deepest trauma and physical brokenness are entirely hidden from view. The court watched as his social standing shifted. He had arrived as a fugitive expecting a death sentence. He instead remained as a member of the royal household. Physical safety was only the first step. For restoration to be complete, he needed his dignity and sense of belonging returned to him. By seeking out a broken man to fulfill a promise he didn't have to keep, David provided a blueprint for the concept of grace. Humanity often finds itself in the exact same destitute position as Mephibosheth, fractured in spirit, keenly aware of our flaws, and hiding out of fear. Divine grace operates exactly like David's decree. It is an active pursuit initiated by the king, based entirely on a covenant, rather than any human merit or capability. God takes the broken and the terrified, covering their flaws, and offering them a permanent, honored seat at his table. By the middle of his reign, King David was rapidly expanding Israel's borders across the ancient Near East. When the king of the neighboring Ammonite Empire died, power naturally transferred to his son, Hanun. Looking to maintain regional stability, David sent a delegation of envoys across the border to offer condolences and build diplomatic ties with the new ruler. But Hanun's advisors were deeply suspicious. They convinced the young king that these envoys weren't there for peace, but were actually military spies sent to map out the city's defenses for a future invasion. Acting on that paranoia, Hanun detained the diplomats and subjected them to severe physical and cultural humiliation. He ordered half of their beards shaved off and had his guards cut their garments off at the waist. In the ancient world, an insult to an ambassador was an insult to the sovereign himself. Overnight, a stable diplomatic relationship evaporated, and a neighboring superpower became an active, hostile enemy. Realizing the severity of what they had done, the Ammonites knew retaliation was imminent. They immediately opened their treasury, used a vast sum of silver to hire thousands of Aramean mercenaries to build a massive coalition force. Their deployment was a classic trap. The Ammonite army positioned themselves defensively right at the gates of their capital city.
Meanwhile, the hired Aramean forces fanned out across the open country, preparing for a wide flanking maneuver. General Joab led the Israelite army forward to meet the threat, marching them dead center into this geographical pocket. By the time he realized the trap, they were entirely wedged between two hostile fronts. The combined mercenary alliance vastly outnumbered Israel's forces. Joab's men were trapped in an open field, facing fortified defenders in front of them and a massive mercenary army closing in from behind. A coordinated strike from both sides would crush the Israelites in a matter of hours. Joab had to figure out how to stop a total massacre when completely outgunned and surrounded on two sides. Joab quickly analyzed the field and made a counterintuitive decision. Instead of clustering his outnumbered men into a tight defensive circle to weather the storm, he decided to divide his forces. He split his army in two. Joab led the elite troops into the open field to strike the Arameans. He handed the remaining infantry to Abishai to hold the line against the Ammonites. They established a strict mutual defense pact to provide instant reinforcements. This structural flexibility secured a temporary safety net, preventing an immediate rout. But battlefield geometry doesn't win fights on its own. Joab still needed a way to break the enemy's morale.
The real anchor of Joab's strategy wasn't his formation. Before charging, he turned to his brother and delivered a very specific mandate. He told Abishai to be strong and courageous. But he didn't ground that courage in their own military prowess. He framed it as a selfless duty to fight for our people and for the cities of our God. Then Joab added a crucial final phrase, "The Lord will do what is good in his sight." He demanded absolute violent effort on the battlefield, while leaving the final outcome entirely in God's hands. Fueled by that absolute conviction, Joab's elite units slammed into the Aramean lines. The sheer ferocity of the Israelite charge shattered the mercenary formation, and the hired fighters broke and ran. This created an immediate psychological domino effect. Watching their highly paid muscle flee in terror across the plains, the Ammonites completely lost their nerve and retreated behind their fortified city walls. The immediate battle was won, but the war wasn't over. Refusing to accept the embarrassment of defeat, the Aramean kings regrouped, marshaling an even larger coalition force for a second campaign against Israel. This time, King David personally took command. He mobilized the entire Israelite army, crossing the Jordan River to meet this newly formed threat head-on. The resulting clash was decisive. David's forces crushed the Aramean command, forcing their kings into complete surrender. They agreed to pay tribute to Israel and permanently abandoned their alliance with the Ammonites. Israel secured the promised land by anchoring their military force in an absolute reliance on divine providence. This battlefield victory reveals the weight of delegated duty. Joab and Abishai were able to stare down a massive mercenary army without paralyzing fear because they understood their actual roles. They were mere stewards executing a specific task, not the architects responsible for engineering the final victory. That ancient military mindset mirrors a clear mandate found in the New Testament. In Colossians chapter 4, the Apostle Paul writes, "See to it that you complete the ministry you have received in the Lord." The underlying reality is that God actively entrusts specific jobs, roles, and responsibilities to individuals today, exactly as he did with those ancient generals. Naturally, stepping into those spiritual roles is difficult. It inevitably invites intense opposition and pressure, and there will be moments where you feel completely encircled by the demands of the work. Viewing personal responsibilities as a divine mandate provides the steady focus required to finish the mission, fighting faithfully while trusting God with the ultimate outcome. It is the season when kings go off to war, but instead of the harsh, dust-choked reality of the distant battlefield, we are here. King David has stayed behind in Jerusalem, surrounded by the quiet luxury of his palace at the height of his reign. A leader's internal discipline often arose when the pressure of the battlefield is replaced by the stillness of the palace. Without a visible enemy to fight, the greatest danger becomes the leader's own unmonitored comfort. This brings us to a rooftop at twilight. David is pacing. He looks down and observes a woman, Bathsheba, bathing. This is the exact fraction of a second where sudden temptation intersects with unearned idleness.
Generations earlier, when Joseph faced a similar moment of sexual temptation, he immediately turned and ran. He understood that sudden temptation is a problem of physical proximity, not willpower. David, however, stops. He lingers, relying entirely on his own perceived strength.
This decision to stay behind removed the daily friction of his duties, leaving him without his usual guardrails. By remaining on the roof, he allows his curiosity to override his judgment, effectively dismantling his own defenses from the inside out. Unchallenged ease turns a palace into a danger zone. This environment of total isolation and comfort creates the specific conditions necessary for a total moral collapse. In theology, the study of sin is called hamartiology, and it reveals a stark mechanism. Secret sin is never a static event. It operates on a snowball effect, a coercive, accelerating momentum that forces passive choices into active atrocities. We can map this progression. This flowchart illustrates the chain reaction, starting here with our first node, idleness. In this passive state, normal critical judgment is entirely bypassed. When boundaries are ignored, the biology and psychology of idleness demand stimulation. The empty space is filled, and the first node inevitably triggers the second, lust. Once the threshold is crossed and Bathsheba becomes pregnant, the system attempts to contain the fallout. Lust necessitates deceit. David recalls Bathsheba's husband, Uriah, from the front lines, trying multiple strategies to manipulate him into going home to sleep with his wife and cover up the timeline. But Uriah refuses to cooperate with the cover-up. The containment strategies fail, escalating the crisis. The deceit now requires the weaponization of David's own military commanders to force a solution. Having exhausted all options to hide the truth, the chain reaches its fatal conclusion. The system locks on to murder. David orders Uriah to be abandoned on the battlefield. To the person caught in this cycle, none of this feels like villainy in the moment. Each horrific step simply feels like a logical, unavoidable necessity to survive the mounting scandal. Human greatness offers zero friction against this momentum. This unbroken sequence illustrates the theological reality of total depravity, the terrifying truth that without divine intervention, even history's most celebrated heroes will fall completely. While the king schemes in a soft bed, Uriah sleeps outside, resting against the heavy wooden door of the palace. He represents the loyal, community-minded believer. He refuses to enjoy the comforts of home while God's honor and his fellow soldiers are still out in the field. Uriah's unwavering, simple integrity stands in sharp, blinding contrast to the dark, complex political maneuvering David is spinning behind closed doors. David is suffering from the illusion of control. He falsely believes he has successfully transitioned from a fallen man into the untouchable director of a flawless cover-up. But maintaining that illusion exacts a terrible price. To keep the secret buried, the director must explicitly silence and destroy the most faithful, honorable members of his own community. Attempting to manage a moral failure through cleverness does not erase the error. It only multiplies the collateral damage, ensuring that the innocent pay the ultimate price for the leader's preservation. At the end of this dark chapter, the text shifts our perspective entirely away from earthly politics. It freezes on a single sobering sentence. The thing David had done displeased the Lord. David's shadow play, the hushed messengers, the forged letters, the planned abandonment, was fully visible to God. Human political maneuvering and secret cover-ups lose all their power when every hidden detail is brought into the light. The biblical narrative refuses to serve as a sanitized record for a national hero. By preserving the crime and forensic detail, it demonstrates that God values the truth of the failure more than the preservation of a king's legacy. Consider that David was Israel's highest ideal, the chosen king and the man closest to God's heart. If the best humanity has to offer can be dismantled by a single quiet evening on a roof, it proves that the problem is an inherent human limitation. This creates a vacancy that only a different kind of king, one like Jesus, who remained unmoved by the same temptations of power and the flesh, could ever fill. When confronted with our own brokenness, the required response is not another attempt to outsmart the consequences. It is the immediate, unconditional surrender of our failures. Restoration begins when the secret is no longer a secret. The illusion of control dies the moment a person stands fully seen under a holy light, allowing God to begin the work that human effort could not achieve. This alphabetic text on the Tel Dan stele is concrete archaeological evidence of the historical House of David during the Iron Age. Yet this legacy masks a hidden corruption. David orchestrated the murder of a loyal soldier, Uriah, to cover up taking Uriah's wife, Bathsheba. For a monarch during this era, there is no higher court. No local magistrate has the jurisdiction to arrest a king, and no civilian jury can sit in judgment of a sovereign. This lack of oversight builds an internal echo chamber. Surrounded by subjects whose survival depends on their obedience, a leader begins to believe that a secret, if sufficiently buried, is no longer a threat. Unfettered power doesn't hide a leader's choices from themselves, but it does hide their vulnerability. It creates a false sense of security that requires an external, uncontrollable force to shatter. That force arrived through the prophet Nathan. Rather than leading with a direct accusation that the king could easily suppress, Nathan presented a fictional legal dispute for the king to resolve. He told the story of a wealthy man with massive flocks who refused to kill his own livestock to feed a guest. Instead, the rich man seized a poor neighbor's single, deeply loved ewe lamb and slaughtered it for the meal. The reaction from the throne was instantaneous. David's sense of justice was most piercing when he was looking at someone else. He immediately decreed a death sentence for the fictional rich man. As the highlight moves through this path, you see how a narrative about a third party circumvents the subject's ego. By the time it reaches the final judgment, David had already condemned the act before realizing he committed it. Our ability to judge others is often a leader's greatest blind spot. It is the moment when they are most objective about the law that they are most vulnerable to their own conviction. The trap closed with 4 words. Nathan mapped the parable directly onto the king with the indictment, "You are the man." Normally, a monarch in the ancient Near East would respond to such a public humiliation by executing the prophet to preserve his image and maintain his grip on the throne. Instead, David offered an immediate confession without any attempt to shift blame. He simply stated, "I have sinned against the Lord." Real change begins only when a person stops using their status as a shield and accepts full personal responsibility for the damage they have caused. This admission leads to a sharp paradox. Nathan immediately declares that God has taken away David's sin and that his life will be spared. Within this legal framework, the pardon is massive. Both murder and adultery were capital offenses, yet the king is spared the death penalty he just prescribed for the man in the story. This is the definition of unmerited grace, a spiritual ledger wiped clean, regardless of the offender's inability to repair the lives they broke. But while the spiritual debt is forgiven, the physical world still reacts to the initial action. The king is left to face the approaching shockwave of his own choices. The first consequence was intimate and devastating. Nathan warned that the child born from David's union with Bathsheba would fall ill and die. David's response was visceral. He abandoned his royal duties, fasting and sleeping on the ground for 7 days in a desperate attempt to plead for the child's life. Despite his mourning, the prophecy was fulfilled. The loss of the child marked the beginning of a generational curse. Nathan's promise that violence would never depart from David's family line. Forgiveness does not cut the chain of cause and effect. Our failures inevitably echo outward, often striking those who had no part in the original choice. The focus moves rapidly away from the king's private mourning chamber, expanding the scope of the fallout to the entire nation. While the king mourned in Jerusalem, his army was still locked in a brutal siege of the Ammonite capital, Rabbah. This was the exact location where Uriah was originally left to die on the front lines. David's hidden sin had now fully bled into the national destiny. His personal choices had forced an entire army to remain in a state of perpetual warfare. This is the dual reality of the story, a profound capacity for mercy existing alongside a cycle of expanding disciplinary justice. Accountability means navigating both. It is the act of accepting the radical gift of forgiveness while still carrying the weight of a world we have fractured. King David is historically remembered as a master strategist and a man of immense spiritual wisdom. Yet he managed to miss a massive, devastating threat brewing right under his own roof. This family tree maps out a complicated royal household. Amnon, David's oldest son, developed a sickening, forbidden obsession with his half-sister, Tamar. Amnon was literally making himself physically sick over his inability to possess her. His fixation was intense and unchecked. How does a seasoned king and brilliant military tactician fail to notice his own son tearing himself apart with destructive desires? A leader's vision is inseparable from their moral standing. When past failures go unaddressed, they trigger a spiritual blindness, a condition where internal compromise effectively erodes the capacity to recognize incoming threats. King David had previously orchestrated the ruthless murder of Uriah to cover up his own scandal with Bathsheba. That hidden sin created a heavy fog over his moral clarity. An unresolved moral failure creates a dangerous blind spot. It leaves an entire family completely defenseless against predators operating on the inside. The plot found its architect in Jonadab. The biblical text defines him strictly by his opportunistic nature. He is David's nephew, and he is extremely cunning. Jonadab tells Amnon exactly how to weaponize his real lovesickness. He advises him to go to bed, fake a severe physical illness, and ask for Tamar to come to his private quarters to care for him. The trap requires a powerful enabler, and David unwittingly steps into the role. The king himself summons Tamar and orders her directly into Amnon's home. David likely thought his daughter's presence would soothe his son's illness. His desperate hope to help Amnon completely overrode any basic protective instincts. When authority figures lose their spiritual discernment, their natural compassion can be easily exploited by malicious actors to facilitate tragedy. Tamar was a virtuous young woman of marriageable age. The text makes it clear she knew the boundaries of Israelite law and tried to reason with her half-brother. But because of the king's own decree, she was completely isolated in Amnon's house. Amnon ignored her pleas and forced himself on her. In the aftermath, Tamar expressed her absolute devastation according to custom. She tore her woven royal robe and poured heavy gray ashes over her head. Her full brother, Absalom, found her in the street. Without needing a lengthy investigation, he instinctively deduced exactly who had done this to her. Absalom knew instantly, proving that Amnon's dark, aggressive desires were obvious to anyone who actually had clear eyes to see them. A leader's willful ignorance forces the innocent to bear their trauma completely alone. It turns victims into outcasts and creates a breeding ground for vigilante vengeance. For 2 full years, Absalom let his silent rage simmer. He plotted his revenge, while David, paralyzed by his own compromises, did absolutely nothing. Then the tension broke. Absalom arranged a feast, waited until Amnon was vulnerable, and had him executed for the assault on Tamar. Knowing the penalty for shedding blood, Absalom fled the kingdom entirely. He vanished into the desolate region of Geshur, living in exile for 3 agonizing years. This massive collapse of the royal family was not random. It tracks backward directly to the prophet Nathan's severe warning to David in 2 Samuel chapter 12. This timeline illustrates the devastating trajectory. God explicitly decreed that due to David's hidden sins, he would raise up disaster from his own house. David now carried the agonizing burden of a permanently fractured family, paying the price of his past actions. God offers merciful forgiveness for the soul, but his grace does not act as an immunity card against the hard, earthly consequences of our choices. We are all susceptible to this exact type of spiritual blindness if we let our own desires go unchecked. When we hide our moral failures, they fester and blur our discernment. The only immediate remedy is to bring those hidden wrongs out into the light through honest confession. By seeking the cleansing clarity of Christ, we can restore our spiritual vision. That is how we protect our discernment and how we stop the tragic echoes of unchecked desires from taking root in our own homes.
You know the exact temperature of the room. You've had the argument,
You formally accepted the apology, and you're back at the same dinner table, but you refuse to look at each other. The words have been spoken, but the emotional distance is strictly maintained. We usually accept this compromise. It feels safe. You drop the immediate conflict without having to risk the vulnerability of actually reconnecting. But this state of half forgiveness, this fake frozen peace, is a highly volatile trap. To see how destructive that trap really is, we have to look at the royal court of ancient Israel. King David is paralyzed. His son Absalom has murdered his own half-brother and fled the country in exile. David is stuck between a father's intense longing to see his son and a ruler's crushing obligation to uphold the law. It forces a profound question. What happens when we try to solve a broken relationship by merely changing the geography without changing the heart? As David is about to learn, partial forgiveness creates a relational vacuum, and that vacuum practically guarantees a deeper, explosive destruction down the road. The impasse is broken by a political manipulation. David's top general, Joab, wants the heir apparent back in the capital. To force the king's hand, Joab hires a highly intelligent woman from a town called Tekoa to perform a bit of theater. She approaches David disguised as a grieving widow. She spins a story about her two sons getting into a fight in a field where one strikes and kills the other. Now she claims the entire extended family wants to execute the surviving son, wiping out her family line. David, moved by the story, issues a royal oath to protect the surviving son from vengeance. The woman drops the mask. She takes David's own legal ruling and holds it up like a mirror to his hypocrisy. She points out the obvious contradiction. He is willing to pardon a stranger's murderous son, but refuses to bring back his own. She anchors her argument in the hard reality of human fragility. She tells the king that we are all dying, like water spilled on the ground, which cannot be gathered up again. Death is final. Our time to fix things is brutally short. She contrasts our fragility with God's active nature. She declares that God does not take away life. Instead, he actively devises ways so that a banished person is not permanently cast out. God builds a road home for the exile. It's a brilliant irony. Wrapped entirely inside a cynical human power play, a hired actor accurately articulates the blueprint for divine grace. God's love is an active, pursuing force. David yields to the pressure. He agrees to bring his son back from exile and allows Absalom to return to Jerusalem. It is a strictly geographic pardon. But then David issues a chilling caveat that destroys any hope of a real reunion. He orders that Absalom is allowed inside the city limits, but he is strictly forbidden from seeing the king's face. For 2 entire years, they live in the same city. Absalom is out of exile, yet entirely isolated. Physical proximity, combined with a deliberate cold shoulder, acts like an incubator for bitterness. The resentment festers in the silence. The isolation breaks Absalom. Desperate to force a meeting, he commands his servants to set General Joab's barley fields on fire. The arson works, earning him an audience with his father, but the psychological damage is already permanent. David's attempt at half-forgiveness accelerated his son's moral corruption. By keeping Absalom in the hallway and withholding face-to-face reconciliation, David created a betrayal that eclipsed the original offense, laying the groundwork for Absalom's eventual violent rebellion. This illustrates the flaw in David's approach. On the left, human forgiveness extends the bridge halfway and stops. It's passive, focused on self-preservation. On the right, divine forgiveness refuses the halfway compromise. It satisfies justice while executing total mercy, eliminating the gap entirely. David's refusal to look his guilty son in the eye reveals a defect in human mercy. We can drop the charges, but we often can't stand the sight of the person who hurt us. It creates a deadlock that David couldn't resolve. This is where the story shifts from a failed royal decree to a cosmic necessity. Jesus Christ resolves the exact deadlock that broke David's family. On the cross, he satisfied the legal requirement for justice while simultaneously opening the way for face-to-face restoration. This requires us to take a hard look at our own communities. Whether in your family, in your workplace, or in your church, you have to choose whether you will tolerate the cold violence of superficial peace. Reconciliation requires looking the other person in the eye. It demands the proactive, often painful work of closing the gap, and then choosing to walk forward together. When you are navigating a crisis, the ultimate comfort is a plan that simply works. You map out a strategy, public support surges, and every milestone is hit precisely on schedule. It is easy to look at that lack of friction and assume you have divine approval, but an unopposed advance can be deceptive. Sometimes a flawlessly executed operation is actually a quiet, unchecked rebellion against the established order. Rapid early success does not prove a cause is right. Often, a suspiciously smooth calm is the byproduct of a failure in daily stewardship. Consider the case of Absalom. He orchestrated the murder of his brother Amnon under the guise of justice, and he entirely escaped the consequences. Over the next 4 years, he was left alone. He used that unchallenged freedom to systematically manipulate public opinion, gathering a massive loyal following to his side. This timeline graph shows the correlation between elite crime and the passage of time. As the years tick by without royal intervention, the curve of Absalom's influence spikes toward an organized uprising. All of this happened under King David's watch. While his son was actively plotting a coup, David remained passive, managing the state while remaining blind to the treason brewing in his own court. It was this neglect of duty that created a political vacuum. Absalom simply walked into the void, allowing his treason to masquerade as the unstoppable will of heaven. When the rebellion launched, the royal court collapsed into panic as loyalists scrambled to evacuate the capital before the rebel army arrived. Panic reveals the true nature of an alliance. Ahithophel was David's most trusted counselor, a man who possessed deep insider access to every facet of the royal administration. Confronted with an exiled king and an aggressive usurper, Ahithophel calculated the political odds. He saw Absalom's momentum and defected to the side with the highest statistical probability of winning. This schematic demonstrates the severe tactical shift that occurs when a chief strategist defects. The intelligence advantage transfers to the rebel faction, leaving the old administration exposed. Relying strictly on political arithmetic has a flaw. It aligns a strategist with human logic, but divorces them from a sovereignty that operates outside of human probability. Contrast that calculus with Ittai the Gittite. He was a newly arrived foreigner, a man with zero political capital and no historical obligation to support King David. He looked at this landscape and knew the cost of following a deposed king into the desert, where dehydration and starvation were certain. Yet Ittai pledged absolute loyalty to the fleeing king, telling him that wherever David went, he would follow. It was a vow that mirrored the ancestral commitment of Ruth. Ittai based his allegiance on faith in God's anointed leader, while Ahithophel based his treason on the temporary optics of a winning streak. Choosing the path of least resistance offers immediate safety, but submitting to a divine order provides the only stability that lasts when the tide of history turns. Walking out of Jerusalem as a fugitive stripped away the luxury of passivity. David saw the direct consequences of his years of silence and realized he could no longer afford to be a spectator in his own kingdom. This shift from observer back to commander allowed him to look past the panic. He identified a specific tactical vulnerability in Absalom's new government and began issuing orders to exploit it. This map shows the covert deployment of David's embedded loyalists. Their mission was to infiltrate the capital's communication network and specifically neutralize the counsel of Ahithophel. The strategy worked. Absalom's structural advantage collapsed as his internal communication was dismantled from the inside out. Raw numbers and initial execution proved powerless against a leader who had finally returned to his role, executing a plan that relied on more than human cunning. Absalom's uprising began with the illusion of frictionless momentum. It ended in his absolute defeat. Once the chaos settled, the underlying theological architecture of the crisis came into focus. The outcome was never determined by the size of the armies. The seduction of an easy, unopposed path is a warning. When an environment feels peaceful,
It demands a focus on detail that most leaders only apply during a catastrophe. Security requires rejecting complacency and choosing to align with a sovereign will that ultimately commands the final outcome of all human history.
David is running for his life. The man who spent decades building an empire without a single military defeat is now a fugitive on a desert road, hunted by his own son. Years earlier, after David committed adultery and orchestrated a murder, he confessed his guilt. The biblical text records that God removed his sin and spared his life. Yet as David flees Jerusalem, his world is falling apart. His spiritual standing with God has been restored, but his earthly life is entering a state of total collapse. This reveals a specific reality about grace. Forgiveness restores the relationship with the Creator, but it does not dismantle the earthly consequences of the choices we make. Understanding David's exile requires looking past his eternal standing and examining the immediate physical discipline of a sovereign God. David's small group of loyalists is exhausted and exposed. They are traveling with limited supplies, moving away from the safety of the capital and into the unknown. On the road, they are met by a servant named Ziba. He offers the starving king a massive quantity of food and wine, followed by a report of treachery. He claims his master, Mephibosheth, stayed in Jerusalem to reclaim the throne for himself. David is a lifelong strategist, yet he fails to question the logic of Ziba's story. It is unlikely that a rival claimant could simply walk into a city during a coup and seize power. Regardless, David believes him instantly and gives Ziba everything he asks for. David is no longer acting with the precision of a king. The weight of knowing he is responsible for this civil war, combined with the physical fatigue of his flight, has eroded his skepticism. He is looking for loyalty anywhere he can find it, making him an easy target for a liar. Before David can lose his throne, he has already lost the mental clarity required to lead. The king's party eventually reaches Bahurim, where they are met by Shimei. He runs along the ridges above the road, where he hurls stones and shouts curses at the passing king. Shimei is a partisan of the former King Saul. He screams that David is finally suffering divine payback for stealing the throne and spilling the blood of Saul's house. David's general, Abishai, immediately asks for permission to cross the ravine and execute Shimei for his public insults. David stops him. He refuses to defend his reputation and forbids any retaliation, even though Shimei's specific accusations about Saul's family are factually incorrect. David accepts the abuse because he is preoccupied with his own history. He knows he has committed murder and betrayal. In his mind, if God has authorized Shimei to curse him, it is not his place to fight back. David demonstrates spiritual maturity by refusing to fight for his image. He recognizes this public humiliation as part of God's righteous discipline. While David suffers on the road, his son Absalom has taken full control of the stone-walled stronghold of Jerusalem. Absalom relies on the advice of Ahithophel, a strategist whose counsel was considered as definitive as an oracle of God. Ahithophel advises Absalom to pitch a tent on the palace roof and publicly sleep with David's concubines. This was a move to signal that the break between father and son was final and that there would be no reconciliation. This political maneuver was the exact fulfillment of a prophecy delivered to David years earlier. After his adultery with Bathsheba, he was told his own household would rise against him, and his wives would be taken before his eyes. God utilized the ambitions of David's enemies to enact justice on David himself. These two realities, David's spiritual pardon and his earthly punishment, run parallel through the story. The text presents a God who is righteous enough to penalize transgressions, even when they are committed by those he loves. True repentance, as shown by David, means enduring the fallout of one's actions without trying to deflect the blame or retaliate against those who point out the failure. In Psalm 3, written during this exact crisis, David describes being surrounded by thousands of enemies. Yet while he acknowledges his situation, he places his security in God alone. Peace in the midst of self-inflicted wreckage is not found by escaping the consequences. It is found by accepting the discipline, maintaining integrity, and trusting in a sovereign care that extends beyond the current crisis. David was exhausted, vulnerable, and fleeing into the wilderness, completely stripped of his royal defenses after Absalom's sudden betrayal. Back in the capital, Absalom's rebel court was consolidating power. The immediate threat to David's life came from a single architect, Ahithophel. This map illustrates Ahithophel's proposed strike: 12,000 elite troops advancing rapidly along a direct vector at night. The sudden raid would induce panic, scattering defenders and isolating the king. The sole objective, his assassination, to legitimize the coup. Against this concentrated force, David's depleted and exhausted faction offered almost no tactical resistance. Ahithophel's plan addressed every tactical variable. By the standard logic of military engagement, David's position was untenable. But a plan is only as good as the council that approves it. Hushai, a secret loyalist, entered the court to sabotage the operation from the inside. Hushai used risk inflation to stall the attack. He weaponized fear by framing David and his surviving men as dangerous, desperate veterans. He invoked the image of a bear robbed of her cubs, convincing the war council that a rapid night strike would result in a bloody, demoralizing stalemate. This risk assessment matrix shows Hushai's impact, recalculating the mission from a high-reward strike to high risk. He proposed a weeks-long mobilization of a nationwide militia instead. This contained a fatal lure, guaranteeing Absalom the personal glory of leading an unstoppable army himself. By playing on vanity, Hushai successfully replaced immediate lethal action with a catastrophic operational delay. Driven by political pride, Absalom formally adopted the mobilization plan, ignoring the tactical urgency of the original strike. This delay secured a singular asset for David, a finite window of time. However, David was still trapped inside a shrinking red kill zone. He would only be safe if he could cross the Jordan River before the countdown hit 0. Survival now relied on raw intelligence moving across enemy lines faster than Absalom's bureaucratic mobilization. Psychological sabotage only bought the opportunity. Now, David's escape required the flawless execution of a covert communications network. Hushai initiated the relay, slipping the details of the delay to loyal priests hidden deep within the hostile city. The intelligence moved from the priests to a female servant, who acted as an invisible intermediary waiting outside the city gates. She made the handoff to 2 embedded spies, Jonathan and Ahimaaz, who began a sprint toward the wilderness to warn the king. But the mission was spotted. An enemy informant identified the spies, compromising the entire network. In the village of Baharim, the spies were forced to hide at the bottom of a dry well to evade capture. A local civilian woman intervened, improvising a camouflage cover by rapidly spreading coarse grain over a blanket stretched across the ground. The intelligence mission was saved by the quick thinking of an anonymous civilian who concealed the evidence in plain sight. With the pursuit diverted, the spies reached David's camp and delivered the urgent directive: cross the Jordan River immediately. Under the cover of night, a weary king and his entire faction urgently waded across the dark water boundary to safety. By dawn, the crossing was complete. When Absalom finally mobilized his massive army, he closed the trap on an empty wilderness. David's survival didn't depend on a larger army. It relied on Absalom's vanity, the risk taken by spies, and a woman at a well. The unified kingdom of Israel has shattered. In an instant, the nation is plunged into a brutal civil war, and the man leading the charge against the crown is the king's own son. Absalom has successfully driven his father from Jerusalem, seizing the throne. Now, 2 massive armies are marching toward a collision in the ancient, rugged forests of Ephraim. As the loyalist troops deploy, King David issues an order that defies the established rules of ancient warfare. He gives a specific, highly irregular command regarding the enemy general. With a single sentence, this crisis shifts. A standard battle for the throne becomes a collision between the hard logic of survival and a father's contradictory decree. David tells his commanding officers, in front of the entire army, to deal gently with the young man, Absalom. David's focus is singular. Even with his throne at stake, he refuses to address a rebel commander. He addresses a son. This directive is rooted in his own history. David remembers Uriah and Bathsheba, inviting this cycle of violence into his home. He views sparing Absalom as a way to halt that cycle, managing his spiritual debt by extending leniency to his failure. David is fighting a two-front war, the rebel army in the forest and the echoes of his past. Out in the physical battlefield, human military strategy dissolves. The outcome of the clash is dictated by a sovereignty David cannot control. The loyalist forces crush the rebellion, leaving 20,000 dead. Yet swords and spears account for only a fraction of the casualties. The rugged terrain of the forest itself acts as an active agent of destruction. Amidst the chaos of this rout, Absalom's vanity, the physical pride he was known for across Israel, becomes the exact instrument of this ruin. As he rides a mule under a massive oak, his thick hair whips into the jagged branches. The animal runs out from under him, leaving the rebel prince suspended and helpless between heaven and earth. Human pride cannot outmaneuver this judgment. Justice operates with absolute precision here, entirely independent of the king's plea for mercy. The rebellion is decapitated, the remaining forces scatter, and the immediate threat to David's throne is gone. To the ancient military mind, this is an unquestionable victory. The enemy commander is dead, and the rightful order is restored. Miles away from that forest, David sits in the shadows of a mud-brick watchtower, removed from the action, waiting for a runner. The army celebrates a kingdom saved, while the king waits in silence, dreading the price of that safety. The runners reach the city gates. The battle is won, but Absalom has fallen. Instead of ascending to his throne, David is seen ascending to the chamber above the gate to weep in absolute agony. He cries out for the son who tried to kill him, wishing he could have died in the place of the traitor. This mourning upends the expectations of his court. David prioritizes the life of the rebel over the triumph of the crown, introducing a mercy that the laws of war cannot explain. David's reaction creates a pattern that extends beyond this specific war. His desire to take the penalty for his enemy suggests a heart that values the rebel more than the rebellion's defeat. This mirrors a larger character, a heavenly father who pursues a humanity that has actively turned against him. The justice seen in the forest is real, the penalty for rebellion is absolute. But David's grief reveals a plan that absorbs that penalty through an act of substituting love. The ultimate message of this narrative is found in the king's cry. It points toward a God who does more than just judge the rebel. He is a God willing to take the rebel's place. Imagine winning a brutal civil war, only to sneak back into your own capital city like you just committed a crime. The rebel leader is dead, the threat is neutralized, yet the victorious army creeps through the gates in absolute shame. Here in Jerusalem, the nation's leader is completely paralyzed. King David is locked away, weeping uncontrollably for the rebel commander who tried to overthrow him, because that commander was his own son, Absalom. This profound personal grief is creating a lethal political vacuum. The civil war left the nation deeply fractured, and David's prolonged silence gives the surviving rebel factions time to regroup. Without a decisive leader at the helm, the conflict is on the verge of reigniting. It takes David's most ruthless and loyal general, Joab, to break the stalemate. He delivers a harsh reality check, telling the king outright, "You love those who hate you, and you hate those who love you." To save the kingdom, David has to leave his mourning behind and resume his post at the city gates. This act of arising marks the end of the combat and the start of a new, high-stakes phase of reconstruction, where national survival depends entirely on who the king chooses to forgive. Statecraft treats every high-level pardon like a line item on a political balance sheet. In this calculation, mercy is rarely a gift. It is a transaction with its own hidden costs. Look at David's most immediate problem. His own home tribe, the tribe of Judah, heavily backed the rebellion. Because they know they're guilty of treason, they are deliberately holding back and refusing to welcome him back to the throne. So David makes a radical offer. He sends a message emphasizing their shared bloodline. "You are my flesh and blood." And then he makes an astonishing concession. He promises to fire his loyal commanding general, Joab,
and give the top military job to the rebel commander, a man named Amasa.
Run that through the ledger. On the strategic gain side, the transaction works perfectly. The tribe of Judah is instantly pacified, and they rush out to welcome the king home. But look at the long-term debt column. David has now established a precedent where armed rebellion can actually earn you a promotion. Worse, he has completely alienated Joab, his most capable enforcer, who just won the war for him. We see this exact same calculation play out on the road to the capital. A man named Shimei, who famously threw rocks at David and cursed him during his retreat, now rushes out to beg for his life, with 1,000 men behind him. David's loyalists immediately demand Shimei's execution. David stops the execution. He publicly swears to spare Shimei's life. By refusing to execute a loud public detractor, David projects an image of a confident, unifying monarch whose authority is secure enough to ignore petty insults. Right after this, David is confronted by 2 more subjects, Mephibosheth and his servant Ziba. They present a messy he-said-she-said dispute over who actually stayed loyal, each accusing the other of lying to steal a massive estate. Figuring out the absolute truth would require a lengthy investigation. Instead, David cuts the knot. He abruptly orders the men to simply split the disputed land equally between them. In both cases, the strategy is pure realpolitik. David willingly sacrifices precise moral justice in favor of sheer speed. Getting bogged down in executions and property disputes would halt the momentum of reunification, so he opts for rapid, sweeping compromises. On the surface, the strategy works. David successfully crosses the Jordan River, seamlessly reclaiming his territory without drawing a single sword. He even takes a moment to honor Barzillai, an 80-year-old loyalist who had funded his exile out of pure devotion.
Barzillai asks for nothing in return, offering a stark contrast to the transactional opportunists vying for power around the king. Yet, the ledger always comes due. By bending over backwards to appease the factions that tried to destroy him, David inadvertently lit a fuse under his most loyal supporters. The first devastating consequence falls on the military. Joab, the fiercely loyal general who was unceremoniously replaced by the rebel Amasa, eventually takes matters into his own hands and violently murders him. Then, the political fallout hits. By focusing so heavily on wooing back the tribe of Judah, David alienates the other 10 tribes of Israel. They arrive at the capital feeling sidelined, sparking a bitter, jealous argument over who has the greater claim to the king. The resulting dispute calcified into a permanent national resentment. The favoritism shown in this exact moment plants the seeds for a fracture that will eventually rip the nation into 2 permanent, warring kingdoms. It leaves us with a grim lesson in statecraft. Political forgiveness is a powerful tool to stop immediate bloodshed. But when a leader abandons justice and betrays their own loyalists to appease their enemies, they haven't actually secured peace. They have merely delayed the next war.
King David's throne is barely holding together. His kingdom is exhausted, still bleeding from a civil war that nearly tore the nation apart. But before the dust can settle, a man named Sheba sounds a ram's horn, sparking a brand new secessionist crisis. Sheba makes a lethal pitch to the northern tribes, telling them they have no share in David. It works immediately, fracturing the nation straight down its tribal borders. Desperate to contain the fallout, David turns to his newly appointed military commander, Amasa, and gives him a strict 3-day deadline to mobilize the army and crush the uprising. Those 3 days are the ultimate stress test. If the king's new administration can't project power quickly, the monarchy will simply collapse. The deadline passes. Amasa fails to rally the troops in time. This delay paralyzes the state's military response, giving Sheba the breathing room to gather followers and gain vital territory. Into this vacuum steps Joab. He's David's recently ousted former commander, and he begins mobilizing for war entirely without the king's permission. This leaves the realm in an uncertain position. It isn't clear if Joab is moving to save the king's realm, or if he is simply exploiting a national crisis to claw back his own lost power.
Joab takes his rogue forces and intercepts the official commander, Amasa, near the ancient site of Gibeon. Joab approaches his rival as if to offer a customary greeting. He reaches out with one hand to take Amasa by the beard, moving in close for a kiss of friendship. In that moment of manufactured trust, Joab drives a dagger into Amasa's stomach. The murder is over in seconds, leaving Joab in undisputed command of the army. This act forces a choice in how we view Joab. He has either committed a cold-blooded murder to eliminate a rival, or he has removed an incompetent leader to ensure the survival of the state. Regardless of the motive, the result is the same. Joab has proven that the rule of law is secondary to the immediate, violent seizure of control. With the army now under his boot, Joab chases the rebel Sheba to the walled city of Abel Beth Maacah. He immediately orders his men to construct massive siege ramps to batter down the city walls. The city Joab is preparing to level isn't a foreign stronghold, it is an Israelite community. To neutralize one rebel, Joab is willing to massacre the very people he is supposed to be defending. In Joab's eyes, any obstacle to his target, even an innocent city of his own heritage, is simply collateral damage in the pursuit of an objective. As the siege engines begin their work, an unnamed wise woman calls out from the walls, demanding to speak with Joab directly. She stands before him and asks a single question: why would he seek to swallow up the Lord's inheritance when she and her people are peaceful and faithful? The response is unexpected. The man who murdered his commander and was seconds away from leveling a city actually halts the siege engines to listen. They strike a compromise. The city will execute Sheba themselves and throw his head over the wall. In exchange, Joab agrees to pack up his army and withdraw immediately. This pivot shows that Joab's violence is not a matter of blind rage. It is a calibrated tool, used at maximum intensity only until a more efficient path to his goal appears. The rebel's head is tossed over the stones. The rebellion is over, the siege ends, and the kingdom is secured. With the threat neutralized, the focus shifts back to Jerusalem. We are left to see how David's government handles a man who used mutiny and murder to save the throne. The answer is found in the official registry of the king's cabinet officials at the end of the chapter. Despite the insubordination and the blood on his hands, Joab is officially reinstated as the undisputed commander-in-chief of the army. In David's kingdom, the loyal protector and the self-serving monster were the same person. Joab's utility to the state outweighed his crimes against it. This is the price of a stable realm. The peace of a righteous king often relies on a man willing to live in the moral gutter, holding the nation together with a bloody, pragmatic sword. For 3 consecutive years, ancient Israel was trapped in a severe, unrelenting famine. The ecological devastation was total. Crops failed, and the national economy ground to a halt as the population starved across parched, cracked earth. In the same chapter documenting this drought, the narrative shifts to intense military combat, detailing the sudden deaths of 4 massive warriors. Read linearly, 2 Samuel 21 reads like a disjointed historical archive. It places a sweeping ecological crisis alongside a localized military roster. This split-screen model highlights the tension within the text. An upper register dictates national ecology, while a lower register details individual combat. We have to determine how a massive drought relates to these isolated infantry skirmishes. This chapter presents these events as part of a single theological framework. The structural pillar uniting them suggests that environmental stability and military success are both tied to the state of the nation's covenant. This framework pairs 2 distinct concepts: the achievement of cosmic order through covenantal atonement and the operational order carried out by distributed human agency. Our objective is to map the specific logic that connects these 2 sides of the same theocratic system. The 3-year famine strikes during the height of King David's reign. Within this ancient worldview, a famine of this duration acts as a diagnostic alert, signaling a rupture in the nation's underlying covenantal standing. This flowchart begins with a clear system error. The prolonged famine serves as the indicator that an unaddressed violation has compromised the nation's relationship with God. David recognizes the signal and initiates a direct diagnostic inquiry to Yahweh. He moves past immediate agricultural relief to find the root cause of the drought. The diagnostic output is specific. The crisis stems from the blood guilt of the previous king, Saul, who systematically targeted the Gibeonites. Saul's crime was a violation of a historical treaty. Generals earlier, Israel had signed a binding pact to protect the Gibeonite people, a pact Saul ignored in his pursuit of political consolidation. The principle here is that the passage of time or a change in administration does not dissolve a covenantal dent. As long as the historical sin remains unaddressed, the entire national system stays locked in a state of ecological judgment. Resolving the ecological error requires a specific transactional restitution. David seeks the terms of atonement directly from the aggrieved party. He asks the Gibeonites what is required to restore the broken relationship. This scale demonstrates the systemic imbalance. Saul's violence has driven the nation's standing entirely out of equilibrium. The Gibeonites demand 7 of Saul's male descendants to be surrendered. In the logic of ancient Near Eastern justice, handing over these descendants serves as the restitution required to settle the debt. The 7 men are executed on a mountain before Yahweh, framing the event as a formal resolution of the spiritual breach. Following this resolution, the text records a critical data point in verse 10. Heavy rain begins to fall. The rain provides physical confirmation that the spiritual debt is cleared. The atonement phase is complete. This ancient protocol implies a broader principle for individual believers. Persistent hardships can serve as a prompt for an internal audit, encouraging the individual to search for unconfessed or systemic failures. Restoring equilibrium requires a decisive and honest processing of these internal breaches. Once the text resolves the drought, it pivots immediately to the operational execution of war. During a battle with the Philistines, King David, the nation's primary leader, is at his physical limit. He is visibly faltering and exhausted. A giant nearly kills him before a subordinate intervenes. Afterward, David's commanders sideline him, insisting he no longer lead from the front. This network map illustrates the shift towards distributed agency. The large central node, representing the legendary leader, reaches its capacity and powers down. The mission does not stall when the central leader fails. Instead, the responsibility shifts to the surrounding nodes. Specialized commanders, David's generals, step into the vacuum to maintain the offensive. These commanders face massive physical obstacles, 4 entrenched giants of the Philistine army. The narrative details 4 separate skirmishes where these subordinate actors successfully defeat each giant. This military roster reinforces a theological point regarding the capacity of ordinary believers. Within a healthy system, ordinary actors can accomplish tasks of significant scale for the benefit of the entire community. 2 Samuel 21 presents these events as a study in theocratic operations. The system model shows a macro-level loop. Sin triggers judgment, and restitution brings restoration. The bottom half represents the agency loop. A leader's weakness is met by divine provision, executed through faith and combat. The author pairs these stories to prove they are strictly interdependent. The narrative implies that covenantal integrity in the land is the necessary backdrop for victory on the battlefield. This requires participants to be proactive about their own internal standing, addressing historical or personal breaches directly. With those breaches resolved, the individuals within the community can function as effective agents in the broader plan. The text illustrates that the external battle against giants is won when the internal, systemic spiritual standing of the nation is restored.
Imagine the absolute lowest point of human vulnerability. You are submerged, choking, and pinned down by a crushing physical weight. David describes this state as being engulfed by the waves of death. Anthropology, in this context, highlights our complete lack of agency. When we face mortality, the text strips away any illusion of self-rescue, leaving us entirely dependent on an external force. This diagram illustrates what the text calls the cords of Sheol, the doctrine of sin, or hamartiology. Sin operates here as an active gravitational force, relentlessly dragging the individual downward and away from safety. Within this environment of spiritual and physical crisis, self-reliance evaporates. Your capacity to swim against that current drops to zero.
Because human strength has no leverage here, biblical deliverance requires a massive, violent intervention from entirely outside the human system. A single, desperate human cry for help shatters the silence, and the reaction from the heavens is immediate. The sky fractures as a violent, macro-level response is mobilized. This demonstrates God's absolute sovereignty over nature. Earthquakes trigger and thunder echoes because physical reality literally bends and fractures to accommodate His will. The rescue also breaches the spiritual realm. Angelic forces, specifically the cherubim, mobilize instantly, serving as God's royal escort as He descends into the battlefield. This massive cosmic arrival for the sake of one person proves that no individual crisis is too microscopic to command the full attention of the sovereign of the universe. True rescue requires a force capable of aggressively overriding the natural laws of the universe to pull the victim out of the wreckage. The cosmic arrival focuses into an intimate mechanism, the breath of His nostrils. This represents the active, life-giving power of the Holy Spirit. This spiritual breath reverses the drowning effect. It pulls the victim out of the deep, suffocating waters, and, as the scripture describes, lights their lamp. This brings us to a central point in the study of salvation. David declares that God executed this rescue simply because He delighted in Him. We often assume we have to earn our way out of a crisis, but this divine delight bypasses human performance entirely. The rescue is unmerited. Salvation is fueled by God's unilateral choice. This makes deliverance an act of pure, unearned grace. David's escape acts as a prototype for a far larger story. The mechanics of his rescue mirror the logic used throughout the rest of the biblical narrative to describe the restoration of all things. The first branch is Christology. David, the anointed king who escaped death, serves as a precursor to Jesus, whose resurrection permanently shatters the power of the grave. Next is ecclesiology. David's vow to praise God among all nations predicts the future church, a community that would break geographical boundaries to witness to the entire world. Finally, eschatology. David's description of enemies being subdued under his feet reflects the biblical promise that all chaotic and hostile forces will eventually be brought under final, sovereign control. When the king's victory, the global witness, and the final peace align, this ancient song becomes a witness to a plan that encompasses the end of history. Now we see David standing safe. The waters have receded, his position is secure, and his enemies are defeated. A victorious ancient king would typically build monuments to his own tactical genius. Instead, David deflects the glory away from himself entirely. This text serves as a permanent manual for responding to success. It instructs us to maintain absolute humility regardless of the achievement. When modern waves of death hit, whether that's a career crisis or a tragedy, our instinct is to fight back using only our own blood, sweat, and grit. We must override that instinct. God is the first line of defense, rather than a last resort used only when our own strength fails. We can cultivate this through the daily habit of counting grace, tracing every success back to its source in divine providence. The admission of complete helplessness triggers the massive cosmic response we see in David's life. It is the necessary starting point for a rescue of this magnitude. Three warriors are sprinting through a dark, mist-filled enemy encampment. They have bypassed guards and risked their lives to fill a single cup with water. They make it back to their camp. Exhausted and covered in the dust of the road, they present the water to their commander. The commander takes the water he desperately craved. He looks at it for a moment, then tips the vessel over and pours it into the dirt. This creates a paradox for the modern observer. David threw away the only physical proof of his men's devotion. Today, a leader who rejects a high-stakes sacrifice in this way would be viewed as disconnected or even ungrateful. It is a reaction that sits outside our modern understanding of military loyalty. This event, recorded in 2 Samuel 23, reveals a specific relationship between power, blood, and the divine. To understand why David poured the water out,
we have to look at how he viewed the cost of his own kingdom. The text captures David in his final days. He is reflecting on his dual identity as both an imperfect mortal king and a ruler chosen by God. David attributes the stability of Israel to his pillars, elite warriors, whose victories he believed were orchestrated by a higher power rather than his own genius. This photograph shows the ancient stone architecture of Bethlehem. During a standoff with the Philistines, David was trapped in a nearby stronghold. In a moment of nostalgia, he longed for water from the well by the gate of this city, which was then occupied by an enemy garrison. 3 of his top warriors heard this casual wish. Without receiving a formal command, they slipped through the Philistine defenses to fetch it. This well represents the moment of their greatest vulnerability. They stood in the open, drawing water while surrounded by enemy forces who would have killed them on sight. When the water left that well, its nature changed. Every drop now represented the potential death of the men who fetched it. When the warriors handed the cup to David, the situation became a crisis of conscience. Because his men wagered their lives, this water was functionally identical to their blood. In ancient theology, blood represented life, the exclusive property of God. For a king to drink his subjects' lifeblood would be claiming divine authority, treating them as a commodity. David chose the ritual of libation. He poured the water into the earth as a formal offering to God. By pouring the water out, David elevated a physical favor into a holy sacrifice. He signaled that the loyalty of his men was too valuable for him to personally consume. This act resolved the tension of David's kingship. It demonstrated how he balanced his authority as a monarch with his secondary status under a higher power. By refusing the water, David defined his place in the world. He was the ruler of Israel, but he recognized limits to what he could rightfully take from those who served him. This contrasts with how modern power structures often function. Many leaders today operate on the assumption that the health, time, and well-being of their subordinates are resources to be used up for the leader's goals. It is rare to see a modern executive or a high-ranking official actively refuse a benefit because the human cost of obtaining it was too high. David's restraint highlights a different model of leadership. The poured water stands as a monument to this perspective. It suggests that the greatest sacrifices made in your name are too significant to serve your own ego, and should instead be dedicated to a purpose larger than yourself. In 2 Samuel, King David issues a simple administrative command to count his military forces. The reaction from heaven is swift and devastating, and divine plague strikes the land. In a matter of days, 70,000 citizens are wiped out, leaving a trail of bodies from Dan to Beersheba. For a modern reader, this reaction is entirely baffling. Taking a census is a routine government function. Counting citizens is how a state organizes its administration and taxes. Yet in this ancient text, a standard headcount triggers a mass casualty event. The paradox deepens when you look at the exact sequence of events in chapter 24. The text states that God was angry with the Israelites, incited David to count the people, and then dropped a devastating punishment on the civilian population for the king's order. We are wired to expect individualized justice. If a leader makes a mistake, the leader should pay the price. One person, one punishment. To understand why a paperwork decision resulted in a massacre, we have to let go of our modern, individualistic worldview and examine a forgotten spiritual law operating beneath the surface of this text. The book of 1 Chronicles tells the exact same story, but adds a crucial detail. It reveals that it was actually Satan who rose up against Israel and provoked David to take the census. This diagram illustrates Israel's spiritual structure: God at the apex, the king in the middle, and the nation at the base. The people harbored hidden sins, creating an underlying rot. This structural vulnerability allows the adversary to bypass the populace and directly strike the king. David's order to count his army served as the explosive, visible symptom of a deep, hidden spiritual infection already running rampant through the nation. This network visualization demonstrates a core biblical concept: communal destiny. In the ancient world, a nation wasn't a loose collection of independent citizens. They were a single, interconnected living organism.
A condition in one area rapidly spreads to infect the entire cluster. We see this dynamic early in Israel's history. In Exodus chapter 32, the people collectively demand a golden calf. The entire community then suffers a brutal judgment for that shared idolatry. The reverse is also true. In Joshua chapter 7, a single man named Achan secretly steals forbidden goods. Even though he acted alone in his tent, the entire Israelite army is routed in their next battle as a direct result of his hidden theft. Applying this structural law to David clarifies his failure. He was dragged down by his own people. The widespread spiritual decay of the population seeped upward, clouding and ultimately corrupting his royal judgment. In this context, the census was a tool used to quantify human strength. By focusing on the sheer number of fighting men, the nation shifted its reliance from divine protection to military size. This headcount served as a formal ledger of self-sufficiency, showing a people who now valued their own numbers above their covenant with God. Within this framework of communal identity, the spiritual health of the people dictates the vulnerability of the crown. The deaths of those 70,000 were the tragic consequence of a failure that belonged to the whole community. The moment the final numbers of the census are tallied, David is struck with intense remorse. His conscience finally wakes up. He realizes he has been played by the enemy, and that his ego has led his vulnerable people straight into a devastating trap. Instead of pointing fingers at the nation's underlying sin, David adopts a posture of spiritual covering. He steps between the angry God and the guilty people, absorbing total responsibility for the failure. The seer Gad soon arrives with an impossible ultimatum from God. He confronts David with 3 unavoidable judgments: 3 years of famine, 3 months of fleeing from war, or 3 days of deadly plague. Operating within a communal system means true leadership requires stepping beyond the glory of shared victories. It demands a willingness to voluntarily absorb the crushing weight of the community's collective failures. Faced with 3 agonizing options, David makes a radical choice. He selects the 3 days of plague, deliberately choosing to fall into God's hands rather than the hands of invading human armies. He makes this choice based on his deep understanding of the divine character. Despite the severe judgment hanging over his head, David knows God's defining trait is profound mercy. This response shows exactly why history remembers David as a man after God's own heart. He earned that title through his radical transparency and immediate, unvarnished repentance the second he faced his own darkness. Most of us have the opposite instinct. When we fail, we hide, delay, and let our mistakes linger in the shadows. But carrying unresolved guilt drains our spiritual strength and actively harms the communities we belong to. The ultimate lesson of the census is that immediate, painful honesty before God is the only way to stop the spread of spiritual darkness and clear the path for the mercy that brings the judgment to an end.